New portrait discoveries are always exciting, and when it's a controversial figure from the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, and moreover one who may have been the gay lover of William Shakespeare, then that's even more exciting. I'm speaking of the recent discovery of a miniature by Nicholas Hilliard of Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton. Today I'm thrilled to welcome back art historians Emma Rutherford and Elizabeth Goldring onto the podcast to discuss this miniature with me, from its highly androgynous appearance to the fact that it was deliberately defaced. Carry on listening to find out how and why. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 106, a portrait discovery of Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton, with Emma Rutherford and Elizabeth Goldring. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, Elizabeth Goldring and Emma Rutherford. How are you?
Very well. Thank you for inviting us back.
Yep, very good. Thank you. Looking forward to our discussion today.
Wonderful. We're here to talk about a beautiful portrait miniature by Nicholas Hilliard that you were both heavily involved in the discovery of and the story around that. Before we get into that conversation, a couple of questions just to get to know you a bit better. So starting with you, Elizabeth, how did you break into working in Tudor portraiture? Where did that sort of come from?
Well, I kind of fell into it by accident, actually. I came at it from the point of view of Tudor literature, actually. I studied English literature as an undergraduate, and then my PhD was a part of an interdisciplinary program that at the time was known as Renaissance Studies. I think it's now possibly rebranded itself as Early Modern Studies. But in any case, though it was interdisciplinary, my primary concentration within that was literature, and I wrote my PhD thesis on Sir Philip Sidney, and was looking at the way he talks about paintings in his poetry. And it was really only a few years after I'd finished my PhD and was thinking about how or if I could possibly turn that thesis into a book that I thought it would be so interesting to know a bit more about what exposure Sidney had to actual paintings, what was hanging on the walls at Penshurst, what was hanging on the walls of other houses he would have been familiar with. And I thought, oh, that's a quick trip to the library. There'll be a book that has the answer to that question. And there wasn't really any information available on that. And I started digging and started to realize that there seemed to be a lot of unpublished inventories of various late Elizabethan courtiers in the Sidney family's orbit, most notably Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, who obviously was Sidney's uncle and the Queen's favourite. And one thing led to another. And before I knew it, I was writing a book not about Sidney's literature, but about his uncle Leicester's picture collection. And from that moment on, I seemed to just sort of have gravitated more and more into the world of Tudor painting. The book I wrote on Nicholas Hilliard, which followed the Dudley book, again, really grew out of that project, having realized that Dudley was Hilliard's first patron of note. I suddenly thought, aha, I think, there's more to be said about Hilliard. So yes, I'm sort of an accidental Tudor art historian. I really fell into it by chance, but I'm so glad I did. I absolutely love it.
Amazing. And same question for you, Emma. Where did you get started in all of this?
Well, I definitely didn't fall into it by chance. I was the most boring child on the planet, absolutely obsessed with history, insisted that every weekend we dragged my whole family to National Trust houses and galleries, and then was lucky enough as an undergraduate to do a joint degree in history and history of art. And then I did a master's in Victorian art and architecture. And my dissertation for that was on portrait miniatures. So I started, my first job was at the V&A Museum, working with their collection of portrait miniatures. So from really quite early on in my 20s, I knew I wanted to work with portrait miniatures. And then I went through the auction houses. And of course, portrait miniatures, their birth is in the Tudor period, and I think what they can tell us about the Tudor period is so extraordinary that it's become a period that I'm rather obsessed with, even though I don't get to look at the real thing very often. So that's really my story of how I fell into it or didn't.
Mm-hmm. Miniatures are fascinating, aren't they? Because they do get less coverage than the larger, the big Holbeins, for example, or the Anthony Moores and stuff. But actually, the miniatures are, in some respects, all the more remarkable because they are so miniature. I mean, it's in the word, but they are invariably so tiny and they pack so much detail into such a small thing.
And I think just for anyone who's interested in history, the idea that perhaps this object has been in Henry VIII's hand, if we're talking about a portrait miniature of one of his wives, and the emotion that he might have felt by looking at it, because portrait miniatures were always supposed to be very emotive and bring out emotions, and we know with lots of documentary evidence that that's exactly what they did. So I think in terms of a window into the past, you can't really get a better object than a portrait miniature.
And with that in mind, and sort of because today's discussion is around a discovery, do you both have, maybe start with you, Elizabeth, a Tudor portrait discovery that you would love to uncover?
Well, going back to the fact that Sir Philip Sidney was the first, was the subject of my PhD thesis. We know that from documentary evidence that Sidney sat to Hilliard, possibly for a cabinet miniature, possibly for multiple miniatures. So far as we know, no miniature of Sidney by Hilliard is extant, but what an amazing thing that would be to find. Sidney, the Elizabethan poet courtier par excellence, Hilliard, obviously the great miniature painter of the age. We know they talked about poetry and painting together. Sidney is the first person to use the word miniature in English to refer to a small image painted in watercolor on vellum. So that would be my dream find. I suspect it may not be out there, but I've got a beady eye out for it.
Nice. And Emma, same question.
So last year, I curated an exhibition at Compton Verney, and during my research, I was lucky enough to be looking at a miniature that was produced by the Hornbout Family Workshop, who were the first miniaturists to paint miniatures in England, and it probably is of Princess Mary, Henry VIII's daughter, and I think it's painted around 1546, so we assume that if it's any one of the three Hornbouts who might have painted it, it could be by Susanna, because her father and brother were dead by 1546 when we think this was painted. So I feel like we're just at the very beginnings of trying to look at the Hornbout family and their production, and trying to discern differences in miniatures between the 1520s and 1530s. So yes, really anything that may potentially be by Susanna, I think would be my next exciting find.
Wasn't that the one that for a long time people thought was Catherine Parr?
Yeah.
Yeah. Was Peter Steffel involved in helping identify it?
Yes. But there's never enough time to do a deep dive into these things, particularly when you're putting on an exhibition. So yeah, I'd love to do some more work on that.
Lovely. And given today's subject matter, do you both have a favourite by Hilliard that people should maybe go away and have a look at?
There's so many wonderful ones, but I have a real soft spot for Hilliard's self-portrait, which is in the V&A. And so listeners could go on to the V&A website, search the collections and have a close look. You can zoom in on it. But it's, I think it gives you a real sense of Hilliard's character and personality. Many 16th century painters, whether painting in large in oils or in little, showed themselves with the tools of their trade, with paintbrush or a palette or something that indicates that that they're portraitists. But Hilliard has none of that. He's every inch a gentleman. and actually looking not dissimilar to the Earl of Leicester, who was his chief patron at this time. Once, I think when you look at Hilliard's miniature and of himself and put it side by side with images he was painting of the Earl of Leicester around the same time, you really can't escape the idea that Hilliard kind of wanted to be the Earl of Leicester. And that really chimes with everything that we know about Hilliard from his correspondence, from his treatise on limning. Social mobility was hugely important to him, and he really liked swanning around behind palace doors, I think. So I would recommend the self-portrait.
Yeah, it's lovely. And it's one of our earliest selfies, isn't it, really, I suppose? And he's very dashing.
Yes, absolutely.
Emma, same question.
Well, you can tell we haven't conferred, because that was going to be my choice, Elizabeth. So, gosh, now I've got the rest of Hilliard's to look at. There are so many amazing ones. So that self-portrait was painted while Hilliard was in France for a few years in the 1570s. And probably, if I'm not allowed Hilliard, I would probably go for the Henri Trois portrait miniature, which he painted while he was in France, and which again is a really very recent discovery that's come to light. Nobody knew that he'd actually painted the king, because he was actually employed for the court of the king's brother. But it's fairly easy to find. I think if your listeners Google Henry III, Henry with an I, of France by Hilliard, it'll come up. And gosh, Hilliard made him really smoking hot. When we know perhaps he wasn't, but yeah, that is a fabulous miniature, beautifully preserved and really quite different. And you can see how Hilliard's soaking up so much of French culture at the time. He would have seen miniatures by the great Francois Clouet, and at first glance, this is very, very French in flavour. So that's probably quite an interesting one to
I've just
to
had
take
a
look
quick
at.
Google. What a hunk!
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Very dashing.
Apparently, you could tell where he'd been at court, because he wore so much perfume that it lingered all around the.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so you could tell where he and his minions, his group of beautiful young men, had hung around at court by the smell. So yeah, there you go.
Oh.
No one ever looks too bad in a Hilliard miniature. I think Hilliard erred on the side of flattery, and that kind of comes through in his treatise on miniature painting. That he knew where his bread was buttered, and patrons wanted to look their best selves in the miniatures they commissioned from him.
To the sort of the main subject really today, we are talking about a Nicholas Hilliard miniature that you were both recently very heavily involved in uncovering. And it's of Henry Wriothesley, the third Earl of Southampton. To begin, Elizabeth, I believe that you were contacted by the family that owned this miniature, and they suspected it was painted by Hilliard. What's the story behind this? So how did it sort of come to be?
Ever since my book, Nicholas Hilliard, Life of an Artist, came out in 2019, I periodically have received emails from members of the public, typically when they're having a clear out and have stumbled across something unexpected. And this was one such example. The owners had read my book, and when they stumbled across this miniature, thought it looked a bit like some of the things illustrated in my book, and sent a photo and asked if I thought it might be by Hilliard. And obviously, when I opened the attachment, I was pretty blown away. You always want to see something in the flesh, but certainly from the photo, it looked like the real deal. Often from a photo, you can tell straight away that something's just not going to have anything to do with Hilliard. So I got Emma involved straight away. Emma and I have collaborated on all sorts of things over the years, most recently an exciting discovery of a cabinet miniature of Lady Arbella Stewart that we talked to, I think, around a year ago. So yes, Emma was involved from the outset, and in due course we got Professor Sir Jonathan Bate involved, but that came a bit later once we had established that the sitter was the Earl of Southampton, which, for reasons we'll no doubt get into, raised the possibility that there might be a Shakespeare connection, and we needed a Shakespeare expert to help us sort of navigate all of the information that we were pulling together.
And Emma, were you, upon seeing the image, were you instantly convinced that this was a Hilliard as well?
Yeah, I mean, as Elizabeth says, you have to remain quite sort of circumspect about things initially, but it seemed to have all the hallmarks of Hilliard's style. It's got quite a distinctive red curtain behind the sitter, which is something that Hilliard introduced in the 1590s. Which was a little bit sort of reinventing the wheel, but it was a wonderful new backdrop for sitters, which emulated the velvet of a curtain, where he used quite a clever technique of dragging a dry brush through very wet paint to create the folds in the velvet. But I mean, one of the first things we did was we got the miniature under a microscope with a conservator called Alan Derbyshire, who works primarily with portrait miniatures and was also at the V&A Museum. And really, once it was under magnification, it had all the signature parts of a Hilliard miniature, the thickly sort of dribbled on lace collar, the attention to detail in the wonderful floral embroidery, the use of gold paint, the sitters wearing a pearl bracelet, and the way Hilliard constructs pearls is very specific, and this was exactly how these had been constructed, and the way the face was painted as well. It was all, there was nothing there that caused any doubt as to the fact that this was by Nicholas Hilliard.
Emma, by extension of that, in addition to that curtain that you reference, are there patterns to Hilliard's work that this image absolutely carries?
Yeah, I mean, this work had a lot of firsts, actually. It was quite interesting that Hilliard, this is potentially the first time we've seen him use the red velvet background, which he then carried on, correct me if I'm wrong, Elizabeth, for about a decade after this. And he also, the sort of gesture that you see in the miniature with the hand coming across, that it's quite an early use of that gesture. Sort of with the hand going over the sitter's heart. But I mean, Hilliard was formulaic up to a point. I mean, he knew what worked. He had a lot of experience. But every single miniature by Hilliard really is so individual, and he didn't copy any. I mean, he didn't do sort of two versions. Yeah, there's sort of similarities and huge differences with this particular miniature.
I think the techniques are classic Hilliard in terms of the way he's rendered the jewels, the way he's rendered the lace on the collar. But as Emma was mentioning, the pose, I think, would have seemed in the early 1590s when this was painted really novel, really unusual to those who looked at it. It becomes a pose that then Hilliard uses on other miniatures in later years, and his most celebrated student, Isaac Oliver, also uses this pose on a number of occasions in the early 1600s. But I think, in the early 1590s, this would have seemed really very, very novel, very, very exciting.
And one thing about the image that I think we can't get away from is that most people would be forgiven for looking at it and immediately thinking it depicts a woman. It's certainly, to a modern eye, deeply androgynous. Now, you mentioned there about how unusual this image was at the time. As an extension of that, was the level of androgyny within this image unusual, or would have Elizabethans known immediately that it actually does portray a man?
It's quite a difficult question. I mean, I would say probably that with most miniatures, if I showed you a miniature, you would be able to say within a split second, without even really particularly thinking about it, that's a man or that's a woman. I'm talking about from the Elizabethan period. And we showed this miniature to really quite a huge number of people just on our phones, and almost everybody said it's a man.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's so although yes, you would be forgiven for thinking it looks like a woman because it has the sort of the classically feminine long hair, the embroidery on the jacket, the pearls on the wrist, a pearl earring. But
The
lots of
facial
those,
features are very delicate as well, aren't you?
yeah,
Quite, you know.
yes, lots of those things in this period were actually worn by men. So
Mm.
yeah, it's Elizabeth, you might want to expand on that.
Well, it's a tricky one. I mean, I think you and I, Emma, went back and forth for a few months because we wanted to do our due diligence. We didn't want to assume one thing and therefore rule out other possibilities. And yes, I mean, we were at one stage, one week, we would be leaning towards the sitter being a woman. The next week, we'd be leaning towards the sitter being a man. But Emma's absolutely right that in our unscientific poll of various people ranging from random family members to very eminent art historians. Interestingly enough, most people did think that the sitter was male. In terms of what Elizabethans might have made of the image, I mean, it's so difficult to say, but I think, and we'll perhaps circle back to this point later in our conversation, but I think that this miniature has such an intimate, private feel. I'm not sure it was ever designed to be seen by more than one other person. I mean, miniatures, we always talk about them as very private, intimate images, much more so than oil paintings hanging on a wall in a long gallery designed to be seen by lots and lots of people. But I think this miniature, even by the standards of miniatures, is an incredibly private, personal one that possibly was conceived as something, as a love token for one person and for that person's eyes only. And presumably whoever that person was would have known exactly who the sitter was and was well acquainted with the sitter. So the question of what Elizabethans more broadly might have thought about the gender may in some senses be slightly beside the point.
Yeah.
In the case of this particular commission. But we, after sort of going back and forth, is the sitter male, is the sitter female, we eventually came to the conclusion that it had to be the Earl of Southampton. One obviously starts by looking at as many extant images from the period as one can, looking for any similar poses, gestures, facial similarities, and Southampton, conveniently, is someone that we know a lot about his appearance because he commissioned a huge number of portraits, and there are also a number of eyewitness written descriptions of what he looked like. And he was known for his androgynous beauty, for his fine-boned appearance, his incredibly long hair, his gorgeous ringlets. We know he took great pride in his long hair. There's a wonderful story about him getting into a scuffle at court with another courtier, and Southampton struck the other courtier, and the other chap retaliated by yanking off or snipping off some of Southampton's locks. And this was recounted with glee by observers who clearly thought Southampton took a little bit too much pride in his long hair. So there was no shortage once we started digging. There was no shortage of visual or written evidence that Southampton looked pretty much exactly like the person depicted in this miniature.
Yeah.
And we spent many, many months on this. And, in the interest of due diligence, we're always looking for other options and ways to disprove the Southampton suggestion. But all roads just inevitably kept coming back to Southampton.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the window in which you actually confirm the identity of the sitter and how you go about that. And based on what you just said, it is literally a case of taking a bit of logic and then looking at the other imagery and sort of figuring out who it can be based on other imagery, resources of descriptions of people and how they behaved. And that's kind of how you landed on it being him.
Yeah, there's also, although we can't really talk too much about the provenance, there was provenance that went back to through the Southampton family line. So we that obviously really helps, and you can't just say, oh, well, it looks a bit like this person. You have to obviously dig a lot deeper than that. But we also consulted a lot of academics and museum curators who specialise in costume and dress, who were able to provide us with lots of other examples of men wearing this type of garment in the 1590s. So yeah, we really went into quite a lot of detail there. But once we sort of really thought, okay, so this could be Southampton, I mean, really the man who stands out at court, who again and again is talked about as having this androgynous beauty and this incredibly long and impressive mane of hair, was Southampton. So yes,
Yeah.
as Elizabeth said, all roads just kept leading back towards him.
Yeah.
And specifically Southampton in the early 1590s. So we found this wonderful eyewitness description of Southampton from 1592, when he was one of several young men who greeted Queen Elizabeth when she visited Oxford on progress that summer. And Southampton is praised as the most beautiful of the young men there. And this eyewitness account makes reference to the fact that he did not yet have down upon his cheek. And there is no down upon the cheek of our sitter in this newly discovered miniature. But it's interesting, if you line up reproductions of all the extant accepted images of Southampton from the 1590s, you can chart a progression from, if we accept, say, circa 1592-93 as a date for the miniature that we've recently discovered. And then you've got a miniature by Hilliard of Southampton in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, which is inscribed with the date of 1594. And you see just the beginnings of a little bit of facial hair. There's then an unfinished miniature by Isaac Oliver from the mid-1590s, which is looking very stubbly. And then by the late 1590s, we've got oil paintings where he's got lots and lots and lots of facial hair. So you can really see this progression, and you can also see someone who also bulks up and fleshes out a bit as he's aging over the course of the 1590s. He looks slightly less waif-like and slightly less delicate by the time you get to the end of the 1590s. So yes, we're very lucky in a sense that Southampton was so vain as to want to commission nearly yearly portraits of himself, and also so lucky that so many of his contemporaries were so amused or appalled by his vanity that they recorded their impressions on paper.
So through that process of elimination, this is probably the earliest image of Southampton?
Yes. There is another oil portrait of Southampton at Hatchlands, which is a National Trust house in Surrey, which, funnily enough, was thought to represent a woman until relatively recently. So there's a pattern emerging here. And that probably dates to around the same time as this miniature. So it's either the earliest or, as close to the earliest as you could get of Southampton.
Got it. Okay. Can you introduce Henry for me? I mean, who was he? What was his connection to court?
Well, I think he's probably best remembered today in terms of what we're going to be talking about with this miniature. The perhaps most significant detail about Southampton is that he was, of course, in the early 1590s, Shakespeare's patron. We know that in 1593, Shakespeare dedicates Venus and Adonis to Southampton. The following year, 1594, Shakespeare dedicates The Rape of Lucrece to Southampton. What's interesting about those literary dedications is that the earlier of the two, i.e. that from 1593, is pretty generic, filled with all the standard tropes that you find when an up-and-coming poet is seeking the patronage of a rich and powerful nobleman. But the following year's dedication, so the 1594 dedication to The Rape of Lucrece, is much more intimate. It's really very unconventional, and it does seem that something has happened, something has shifted in the poet-patron relationship in that year. They certainly seem to know each other by 1594. And Southampton has often been suggested as a model for the fair youth of Shakespeare's sonnets. So I think that is probably how Southampton is best remembered by history, and certainly all of that information, as we'll see presently, is potentially directly relevant to this miniature.
He was also, I think he was quite heavily involved in Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex's potential plot to oust the throne as well, wasn't he?
Absolutely. He ends up in the Tower later on. Yes, so often getting into all sorts of scrapes. And in the early 1590s, so around the time that Hilliard would have painted this miniature, Southampton was a ward of Lord Burleigh, and Lord Burleigh wanted Southampton to marry his, i.e. Burleigh's granddaughter. And obviously, as an earl, in a sense, Southampton's main task in life was to produce marry and produce a legitimate male offspring so that the earldom would not die out. But he was very, very, very resistant to marrying, and effectively jilted Burleigh's granddaughter, for which he had to pay a £5,000 fine, an enormous amount of money. He does later marry. In 1598, he marries Elizabeth Vernon, but it was noted at the time, and has been noted by many scholars since, that Southampton had a lot of very close male friends in the early 1590s, many of whom themselves never married, in 2 cases leading to dukedoms becoming extinct. So questions have often swirled around Southampton's sexuality and his self-presentation at court with the very flamboyantly long hair, no doubt fueled that sort of gossip and innuendo. And again, for reasons that will become clear in a moment, all of that may be directly relevant to this miniature.
Emma, could you walk me through some of the symbolism that we can see within the miniature? You mentioned earlier briefly about the hand holding hair over the heart, as an example. So what's that pointing to? What else can we see within the image?
Well, I think it's important to remember that portrait miniatures traditionally are commissioned at a time of betrothal, so when someone's about to get married, and they're inevitably exchanged. So give your miniature and you receive the miniature of the person you are about to marry. And one of the questions that we very first thought of when we finally decided, okay, so this is a male sitter, is this a portrait that you would give to a potential wife in the 1590s, in the late Elizabethan period? And the sitter is not presenting himself as a potential husband. There's no attempt here to show someone sort of in a manner of perhaps someone who might be into jousting or sporty, or I'm sort of going through a kind of Tinder profile here, but he so that sort of confounded us a little bit. But the gesture of the hand across the heart, I think you can look at that as a very human gesture. Portrait miniatures are really focused on the head and the upper torso of the sitter. You very rarely get the rest of the body. So in order to get some sort of gesture in here, you have to bring the hand up. And the way that the fingers are intertwining through the hair and are going over the heart, I think anybody looking at this miniature, you get a little shiver of the sort of emotion that's trying to be conveyed, which is one of sort of sensuality, but of sort of heartfelt sensuality here. And it's a gesture that becomes more formulaic as the decades go on and other artists use it. But at this stage, there's a sort of rawness to it that I think your viewers, when they see the portrait, will be able to see.
Obviously, what does make this image really exciting beyond the discovery itself is the possible other side of the story, one in which Southampton was possibly William Shakespeare's lover. So could you, both walk me through how the rumour of Shakespeare having a male lover came to be, and why is it that Southampton is the one that's the suspected lover as such?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there were in the early 1590s all sorts of rumors, and beyond the early 1590s, really throughout the late Elizabethan period. In 1594, Thomas Nash dedicates his Unfortunate Traveller to Southampton and praises him in sexually ambiguous terms, which suggests, I think, a possible link, or certainly a perceived link, amongst late Elizabethans between Southampton and Shakespeare. So Nash describes Southampton as a dear lover and cherisher. You are as well of the lovers of poets as of poets themselves. And this is 1594, the same year that Shakespeare dedicates The Rape of Lucrece to Southampton, which is the more intimate, the more unconventional of his two dedications to Southampton. So I think you get right from 1594-ish, this suggestion that some people at court think that the relationship between Shakespeare and Southampton is somehow, there's a little bit more to it than to the standard patron-poet relationship. And this is something that then is picked up on by biographers of Shakespeare through the centuries. I mean, I think going right back to John Aubrey, writing in the early 17th century, who's effectively Shakespeare's first biographer. He has a story about Southampton apparently giving Shakespeare £1,000 for some important purchase that Shakespeare couldn't afford. And Aubrey talks about Shakespeare having enjoyed special favour and friendship from Southampton. So this is kind of a recurrent theme that goes really right back to the 1590s with Nash. And of course, there are all sorts of reasons why one might think Southampton is a very feasible candidate for being the fair youth of the sonnets. So possibly just worth reminding listeners that the opening sonnets, the first 17 or so, are often referred to as the breeding poems, because a beautiful young man is being urged to marry and procreate so that his beauty is replicated and does not die out. And so the fact that Shakespeare is probably writing those lines in the early 1590s, a time when Southampton himself is resisting calls from Lord Burleigh to marry, is one possible parallel. But there are all sorts of other reasons to think that Southampton might be the fair youth. There's a lot of wordplay on one and all in the sonnets, almost obsessively so. And the Southampton family motto was one for all for one. We all normally pronounce Southampton's name Wriothesley, but his descendants claimed in the 19th century, who knows if this is true, but they claimed that in the late 16th century, it was pronounced Roseley. If so, it may be significant that there is a lot of rose imagery in the sonnets, particularly those opening ones. Sonnet 1, from fairest creatures we desire increase, that thereby beauty's rose might never die. Certainly rose imagery seems to have had some significance to Southampton, regardless of how he was pronouncing his name, because we know that Titchfield, his mansion, was emblazoned with heraldic representations of roses. So there are all of these, admittedly circumstantial, but all of these little nuggets of possible evidence that might suggest that Southampton is, if not the inspiration, an inspiration for the fair youth of the sonnets. And one of the sonnets describes the fair youth as having, likens his hair to marjoram, which it has long tendrils, curly tendrils, a bit like the sort of hair that we know that Southampton had. So, I don't think we'll ever know what was going on in Shakespeare's mind, and which youth or youths, plural, may have been inspirations for the poetry. But it's not completely out of left field to suggest that Southampton might have been a model, particularly given that we know that they were in contact and had some sort of patron-poet relationship that seems to have been a bit friendlier than most in the early 1590s when Shakespeare, we think, started writing the sonnets.
And Emma, I mean, I think, as we've also mentioned, miniatures are very often love tokens. So that does add weight to this being created for someone with whom Southampton was romantically attached to.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not beyond the realms of possibility that portrait miniatures were exchanged between men as well as between men and women. Certainly exchanged between women. So yeah, I mean, I think I certainly was quite surprised, having not really studied Shakespeare since my school days, just how his sonnets in particular are, you know, we know this is a man addressing another man, and the language is so extraordinarily sensual and erotic, you know, calling the subject of the poem also the master mistress of my passion. Shakespeare's clearly discussing somebody or describing somebody who is androgynous. Are they a master? Are they a mistress? We don't know. You can't tell by looking at them. So this just everything I started to read, it was almost as if Shakespeare was painting this portrait by Hilliard through his words, through his sonnets. So yeah, the plot really thickened, but I mean, there's always been sort of discussion around Shakespeare's sexuality as well, and there have been attempts to make the pronouns in these sonnets, instead of it being a man addressing a man, that publications have actually changed the pronouns so that it's a man addressing a woman. So clearly there's been some anxiety around sort of Shakespeare's sexuality in the 18th and 19th century.
There's also the exciting fact that this miniature has been defaced, albeit on the back. Before we go into the detail around that, though, for some context, could you maybe explain, Elizabeth, how miniatures are physically created?
Sure. So miniatures are painted in watercolors on vellum, and the sheets of vellum that Hilliard and his contemporaries used were onion skin thin. So they would not have laid flat on their own. They would have curled up at the edges. So in order to create a work surface that you could actually apply paint to, something that's stiff enough to actually lay flat, Hilliard and his contemporaries affixed these thin sheets of vellum to typically an ordinary playing card, just to have something stiff enough to make the vellum go flat, and they've got a proper work surface. So today, if you take a miniature out of its frame and protective glass, often when you flip it over, you can see a little bit of that playing card. So you might see a diamond or a heart or what have you. And there is some debate amongst art historians as to whether or not there is significance to the suit of card that Hilliard chose. Did he just grab whatever was to hand on the day, or was it coded in some way? Did he, for example, use hearts specifically for miniatures that were intended as love tokens? And I'm not sure we'll ever have a definitive answer to that. But what was interesting about this particular miniature, when Emma and I looked at it with Alan Derbyshire in Alan's studio, when we got it out of the frame in glass, we saw that it had been originally painted on, or rather the backing card was a heart. So maybe a sign that it was intended as a love token. But the really extraordinary thing that stopped all three of us in our tracks, because we'd never seen anything like it before, was that this heart at some point in the miniature's history had been painted over with black paint with something that kind of looked like a spade. And I think initially we did sort of assume it must be a spade, but I think even in the moment we were all thinking it's an odd looking spade. It's quite a thin, pointy spade. But the main thing that was just so shocking to all of us was someone had gone to a huge amount of trouble to obscure this heart. It's not easy to get a miniature out of the frame. Presumably, whoever Southampton presented this miniature to, it was a gift that he encased in probably a gold locket, some expensive piece of jewelry, because miniatures were often in this period worn on the body, particularly ones that were love tokens. You could have it with you all the time and close to your heart. So somebody went to a lot of trouble to get this thing out of its locket, and then obscures the heart. And it's, there's absolutely no way, apparently Alan tells us, and he's the expert, he would know about this sort of thing. There's no way to tell at what point in the miniature's history this was done. But it's such a violent emotional reaction that I think, for me at least, logic would dictate that it's much more likely to have been done relatively soon after the miniature was painted by someone who actually knew the sitter, i.e. the original recipient, rather than someone, coming along 300 years later and just deciding, I'm a bit bored today, I'll, paint over the back of this miniature. So for me, even before we knew who the sitter was, even before we knew, is this a man, is this a woman, my first thought on seeing the way the back of the miniature had been vandalized was, this is someone saying, you've broken my heart. I think it's difficult not to read it that way. But it really was the most extraordinary moment because, between us, Alan, Emma, and I have looked at a lot of miniatures, and just it was no precedent for this. It's such an intense reaction. But as Emma said earlier, miniatures do seem to be objects that elicit strong reactions and strong emotions.
And forgive my ignorance, what actually is vellum?
It's calfskin. So,
okay.
Yes. So a bit like parchment. And
what is the significance of the spade, probably an arrow? Because I believe, Emma, wasn't it part of William Shakespeare's coat of arms?
Yeah, I mean, at the time that we were looking at the back of this miniature, we were right at the beginning of our research. So it was just really shocking to see the back of a miniature with the suit obliterated like this. And I mean, there's quite a lot of imagery around this period of hearts being pierced by an arrow. And of course, that's someone saying, you've pierced my heart. It's a love thing. But this was someone trying to get rid of the suggestion of love by blacking it out with this arrow or spade or spear. It doesn't seem to relate at all to clubs or spades in terms of the suits of hearts. Doesn't look anything like one of those suits. So it is either an arrow or a spear, and we know that Shakespeare's father was in the coat of arms. There is a spear which was awarded in 1596. So it became a Shakespeare family device. Was the spear incorporated into their coat of arms? And Shakespeare, he puns on his name endlessly. I mean, it was a great name to pun on. Will and spear and shake, and it's just you find it all over the place in his writings. So I mean, when we showed the miniature to Sir Jonathan Bate, who's a great Shakespeare scholar, a little bit further down the line, we still weren't quite sure what to make of what we were uncovering, but he really ran with it, and he sort of said, I think we can dare to dream. There is a possibility. It is that this miniature was given to Shakespeare by Southampton. Southampton certainly could afford a miniature from Hilliard. Shakespeare probably not. And that when Southampton later married, it's possible that the miniature might have been returned and that the heart was obliterated by this spear. So I mean, it's just so tantalizing, and it's frustrating that we can't be definite, but perhaps that is part of the magic of the story.
Yeah. Because it's also it is I mean tantalizing I think is the right word because I think we've all been rebuffed in life at one point or another in the romantic sense, and to consider the possibility of Shakespeare having, I suppose, a grudge, and being very upset about potentially having been cast off, to then take this miniature and deliberately deface it on the back is very palpable, but also quite believable.
Yes, I completely agree, and I think having spoken about miniatures in such emotional terms earlier on, when your listeners see this spear on the back of the miniature, the human hand behind it is completely clear, and you can just about see the heart through it. It's not being completely blacked out, but you can see that somebody has done this, and in a sort of rather amateur way. But the backs of miniatures, I've never ever seen a 16th century miniature defaced on the back like this. But I have seen later on in the 18th century artists writing really nasty comments about their sitters. Richard Cosway in the 18th century has clearly been asked to undertake a commission of somebody he finds totally vile, and he writes a really nasty note on the back of this miniature, which of course was covered up by the frame. So so the sitter would never ever have known that he called her all sorts of words on the back. It was his little sort of moment of revenge. So it sort of makes sense that one would do this in a fit of passion.
Yeah. Well, my final question for you then is, are we going to be able to see this miniature? Is it going on display anywhere, or is it sadly gone back to its owners?
Well, it's now in a private collection, so it's not with the original owners. It's gone into a private collection, but there are plans afoot to show it in public, probably next year at some point, if we can get moving. So yes, I think the owner is determined. This is the beginning really of the journey of the research. We're so looking forward to people coming up with their own ideas about this, and the owner is very, very keen for it to be seen in public at some point. So yes, watch this space.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, thank you both very much for coming back onto the podcast to discuss this beautiful little miniature with me. I mean, am I right? I think it's only like 2.5 inches big. It's really petite, isn't it?
I think slightly less than that. I think it's maybe 2.25, if that. It's oval. So yeah, it really, fits in the palm of the hand. And yes, it is private, personal, intimate. And to think, it's really thrilling to think that, we have held this object that, well, Southampton surely held in Hilliard, but possibly Shakespeare as well. It's going back to something Emma said at the beginning of our conversation. That is the thrilling thing about portrait miniatures. It's such a direct connection with the past in terms of holding these objects that have been held by great historical figures, but then also, great historical figures possibly on a bad day. Shakespeare not, living his best life the day he heard that Southampton had married Elizabeth Vernon. So, yes, really, really exciting stuff.
Yeah. So, thank you again for coming on the podcast. As I said, Elizabeth, start with you. Where can people find you across social media?
On Instagram, elizabeth.goldring.
Wonderful. And are you able to say what you're working on at the moment?
Yes, I have a new book coming out November 11th in the UK, January 6th in the US. It's Holbein, Renaissance Master, published by the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art and distributed by Yale.
Wonderful. And Emma, same question.
So I am, it's portrait_miniature on Instagram, and www.portraitminiature.com is my website. And what am I working on? Well, I'm working on an exhibition of miniatures relating to Marie Antoinette, which opens on the 20th of October in London. So details of all of that's on the website. So yes, about as far away from Shakespeare as you can get, I think, but it's still good fun.
That's Times Beauty. So that's not, because there's a Marie Antoinette exhibition at the V&A as well, isn't there? But I think that's to do with like cultural impressions and stuff.
Yes, so we've been gathering portrait miniatures, which will be for sale over the last couple of years, knowing that this exhibition on Marie Antoinette was opening at the V&A. So yeah, we're marketing it as the original merch. So it's portraits of her and her husband and her children and courtiers. There's a really fantastic miniature of a poor man who's been totally stitched up by one of the tribunals, and it's painted in his prison cell, so you can see the prison wall and window in the background the day before he was sent to the guillotine. So, I mean, historically, portrait miniatures were really important at this period, and we have about 20 for sale relating to the period. So yeah, they will be on view in London for a week from the 20th of October.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again very much for coming onto the podcast, and hopefully we'll speak again soon.
Be lovely. Thank you, Adam.
Thanks, Adam. That's great.
That brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. Thank you very much for listening, and my apologies for the podcast being 24 hours late. My thanks to Elizabeth and Emma for coming onto the show to discuss this remarkable tiny little miniature with me. Next week, I'm thrilled to be welcoming back onto the podcast Lauren Johnson for a discussion all about King Henry VI. Was he as much of a disaster as we've all been led to believe? Tune in next Thursday at the regular time to find out.